So welcome to the MTL Seminar, which is also this time joint with a MedRC seminar. And today I'm very happy to have Sudha Maniam from GE Global Research Center here to speak with us today. Let me give you a little of Sudha's background. She spent the past 23 years in healthcare field in both academic research at the University of Pennsylvania, also the University of Iowa. And then she's been with industry, namely at GE, since that time. She's had several key roles. They include head of MRI systems engineering leader for GE China's MRI business. Sudha and I were chatting up here, and she told me she spent 6 years in China, both in about half in Beijing and half in Shanghai. So she's a pioneer, shall we say. She's also leading now currently a group of highly qualified technical experts in GE's Global Research Center, and a special focus on R&D systems and algorithms for medical devices of the future. When I talked to Sudha before, when we invited her, she asked what kind of talk. I said it's a broad audience. They could be interested in a lot of things. And she said, well, I'm not going to talk so much about GE's things, but I'm going to have a broad talk that will be interesting to the whole group. So without saying much more about it, I'll announce the title and let Sudha entertain us and actually, I think, bring some very interesting insights from what she's told me already. So in Sudha, let's hear Finding the Sweet Spot for Technology Amidst the Changing Face of Healthcare.
Thanks, Charlie, for your kind words. Thanks for having me here. The next 40 minutes or so, I'm hoping to help you understand, where healthcare is going in the U.S. and also across the world as well, and where technology has played in the past and where it's potentially going to play in the future, and how we actually have to change the way we think about technology to be able to address the needs in healthcare, okay? And if you have any questions, I don't know, Charlie, if you want to keep the questions to the end, I'm okay that way. I'm okay either way, so, right?
Either way.
It's all right.
Either way, but if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll just run over with the microphone.
So with that, again, healthcare, the healthcare system in the US and the rest of the country is completely turning around, right? If you look at it today, the patient is in the bottom of the triangle, right? The payers and the insurance agencies are the ones who actually control what happens. Then it comes, the hospitals decide what procedure to do, and then the PCPs decide, and the patient does not necessarily get a specific say in what exactly has to happen with their treatment or their treatment option, right? That's what it is today. What's happening, the whole change that's happening is the whole triangle is flipping around, right? The patient is going to be at the center of the whole core. The patient is going to actually have full control of what they do, how they do things, what treatments they ask for, and so on, and very in tight collaboration with their doctors and PCPs. And the hospitals will play a small role. It's probably going to play a much smaller role in the future compared to what it is today. And then the payers and the insurance will be in the bottom of the triangle, if you would. So that's the whole where the healthcare thing is completely flipping around, right? And the problem is that the healthcare system is already very, very complex and very, very interconnected, right? So you have the payers, the insurance, and the government. And I don't know how many of you know, but the government is actually the biggest payer of healthcare across the world, not just in the US, right? I mean, about 60–70% of the healthcare, some of their spending is actually on healthcare-related projects. The hospitals and the healthcare providers, they are squeezed by the government in doing different things. They have to work with the government to try and make sure that they're following things. The medical companies like GE, right, we want to come up with new products every time. We want to try and make sure that we are providing what the hospitals and the healthcare providers need. And society is making a huge, huge impact. I mean, you've all seen the NFL players wear pink, right, for the breast cancer month of October. That is actually trying to create more awareness, trying to create, making everybody, influencing the patients significantly more than it's ever done before, right? Again, the breast cancer month is this October is breast cancer month, and you see all the players, right? I haven't seen the NBA players, but the NFL players at least wearing pink shoes and pink everything, right? So there's just, it's a pretty complicated but very tightly interconnected system, right? But in addition to that, the metrics that each of them actually have are conflicting with each other, right? So for us to actually make healthcare, the new healthcare system work, we have to figure out how to make everybody work together to try and help the patient better, right? But if you look at the metrics that they have, the government and the payers are trying to reduce cost. I mean, I'll show in the next slide or so how much of the money the government actually spends as a percentage of the GDP, but they're trying to reduce the healthcare costs. So they squeeze the healthcare providers in saying that they have to provide cost with better care, but with much lower cost. But the healthcare providers and the hospitals are looking for profitability. They want to give better care so that they can attract patients into their hospital system. However, they have to be profitable. Today, the hospitals, if on an average, at least in the US, their profitability is about 3%, right? Which is a pretty small, I mean, if you look at a business, right, 3% profitability is pretty bad, right? And in order for them to survive this huge change that's happening in healthcare, they got to figure out ways to try and become more profitable, right? So they are constantly looking at how can I be profitable? Well, the government and the payers are actually trying to squeeze them even more and more. The medical companies like GE, I mean, we want growth, right? We want to try and grow our bottom line. We want to try and grow the profitability as well. We don't necessarily want to try and, I mean, we're not a for-profit company, right? We are a company that we're looking for profitability. So how do you try and make sure that you're addressing all of the different conflicting metrics that we have and provide what the patient actually needs in the end, right? The society is looking for standard of life, as I said, with breast cancer awareness, with all the other, with obesity awareness and everything else. The society is playing a much bigger role in the overall healthcare system as well, and forcing the government and the payers and others to do certain things that they never did before, they never thought of doing before. And the patients again, right? At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're healthy, treated properly at the lowest cost possible, right? That's sort of and the metrics are, and if you think about the metrics, right, all of them are sort of pulling the whole thing and conflicting and pulling it in different directions. So how do we try and address this big complex ecosystem and try and figure out how to make the best technology, how do we make technology work for this changing ecosystem, right? In addition to this, in addition to the fact that the metrics are all in conflict with each other, there are some pieces of it are getting worse, right? If you look at the healthcare costs, right, the healthcare costs are the primary driver of the country's debt, the US and other countries as well. And it's increasing as a percent of GDP, right? Does anybody want to guess what the percentage of cost the governments actually pay for healthcare costs? It's about 60% or more. I mean, so it's not small, and it's growing, right? And if you look at the bipartisan, there's a small graph that I have there from the bipartisan council. What they are saying is by 2020 in the US, the healthcare costs will overtake all of the other programs, including Social Security, including Medicare, all of the other programs. By 2020, it's going to exceed the overall cost, right? So that's a problem. And the second thing that's changing dramatically is chronic disease, right? Chronic disease is everywhere right now. The number of deaths that are happening in the US and in the world is just increasing because of chronic disease, right? And then there's more and more people are overweight. 1 billion people are overweight in the US and in developing and developed countries. That is causing more chronic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure and everything else. The other piece is that the third aspect of it is that the demographics, right? The demographics is completely shifting, just like in Japan, where you have more aging, more elderly people in the country. The US demographics is changing as well, right? Today, if you look at it, there's one person above the age of 65 to 10 people who are actually in the workforce, right? By 2020, that's going to flip around completely, right? This is WHO data that says that in 2020, there's going to be 10 people who are going to be retired and not necessarily contributing to the pension fund or to the Social Security and there's going to be one person who's actually in the workforce. I mean, that's going to be the ratio. What does this mean, right? People are going to be living longer because of the chronic disease challenge. They're going to be living longer. They're going to be living sicker, so they have to be taken care of, right? And because of all the healthcare technology improvements that we've done, the whole lifespan that we have, the mortality age, right? So when people die is actually getting higher and higher. So we have people in the system who are living longer, who are sicker, and who are not necessarily in the workforce. So the cost of the healthcare system is even worse. So how do we address for this, right? What do we do? Because most of the chronic, I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about it in the following slides, but how do we try and make sure that we actually take care of the chronic diseases out there and manage it so that the healthcare costs are not going up, all right? And then the last piece is the healthcare reforms, right? I don't know how familiar you're with, you've probably heard the Obamacare, but the healthcare reforms is not just in the US, it's happening all over the world, in China and India and other places. And it's a value-based healthcare, right? So until now, if you went to the hospital, I went to the hospital I said, my knee is hurting, or it's making a clicking sound. And immediately the orthopedic surgeon said, oh, let's go take an x-ray. And I said, wait a minute, what are you going to see in an x-ray? I don't have a broken bone. Why would I do an x-ray? Right? I know enough to ask that question, but not everybody does, because I know that an x-ray is not going to show anything that they can actually address the problem that I have. An MR maybe, but not an x-ray, right? So why are you doing an x-ray? But that's what they do. They just say, you know what, I need to make sure that because right now, today, what they have is they get reimbursed for every procedure that they do, right? So they get paid for every single procedure they do. The healthcare reform is changing such that it's going to be a fee for service, right, or fee for outcome, in the sense that if I go in with the knee pain, the hospital system is going to get paid X amount of dollars to treat me completely, right? And the hospital has to decide what am I going to do, right? Where am I going to spend the money to try and make sure that I actually provide the right outcome and the right diagnosis and the treatment as well, right? So that's a huge change that's happening. It's happened in some places already, and it's changing as well. And that's a huge shift for the hospital systems, for the patients, for the payers, and everybody else as well, right? And then the other piece is, tying back to the chronic disease, hospitals are getting incentivized or penalized if they actually have a person come back into the hospital within 30 days of their discharge. So if somebody came in with a chronic disease, they came into the hospital, they came back again within 30 days, the hospital system is actually going to get penalized for that, right? So that's a different mindset right now, because previously they would say, okay, they don't have to worry about how do we try and manage the patient and so on outside of the hospital. So what's happening right now, it's moving, again, as I said, the triangle is sort of getting completely inverted, right? So the whole healthcare system in the US and the rest of the country, the rest of the world, is moving towards a patient-centric healthcare, okay? So what does it mean, right? It's moving from the hospital to the home, right? As I was saying before, want to make sure that we keep the patients at the home, provide the right care for them there, provide them the right, assistance, whatever they need to be able to manage their chronic diseases, for example. I mean, again, the healthcare reforms is helping there with that, I talked about all of these before, right? What is enabling this right now is mobile technologies out there in the homes all over. I mean, everybody has a cell phone. Everybody has access to the internet. Everybody has that. And trying to make it everywhere, right? Because what we want to try and do is make sure that when a person comes to the ER, for some chronic disease and they're treated and they go back, that we keep them out of the home. So what are the things that we can actually do to try and enable that, right? I'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. The second piece is patient compliance. I mean, I have to give an example of, a personal example. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, my mom had a knee surgery, right? A complete knee replacement surgery. And I happened to visit her about a week after her surgery, right? I don't know if you know, but the knee surgery itself is useless if the physiotherapy following it is not followed to the strictest regimen, right? So, and I went home, she had the surgery, about a week later I was there, and she was using her walker, and she was saying her shoulders were hurting a lot, right? guess what? Nobody told her that she's supposed to put weight on that knee, so that she can recover and actually start walking again, right? So who is actually following her through the whole recovery procedure? Because the process, so all the money that she spent on the surgery was going to be a complete waste because nobody was following through that she was actually following the right, physiotherapy regimen, for example, right? So I happened to tell her that, you better get this fixed or you're never going to be able to walk. And I sort of had to scare her a little bit, saying you're never going to be able to walk in your life again if you don't do this. So, but the point is that patient compliance is not there, right? We don't have a mechanism today to try and make sure that patients are actually complying with their medication, complying with their post-surgery regimen, anything, right? Even the medication, right? One of the reasons why the chronic patients come back into the hospital within a month or so, constantly, is because are they taking the medicines at the right time, right? Are they taking the right medicines at the right time? Are they taking the correct dosage on a regular basis? All that, right? Those are all things that we don't look at today in the hospital systems, here in the US or anywhere in the world. And those are going to become more and more critical for us to understand how do we try and address these challenges that are happening out in today's healthcare system, right? Health awareness has become a big, big part of it. And again, I was talking about the society, right? How society is influencing the healthcare. Patients are getting more health aware. More information is available out there, so they're trying to figure out what is it that they need. I mean, if somebody says, I need a knee surgery, there's information out there or data out there to try and look it up and say, okay, do I really need a surgery? What do I need? Who do I go to? And so on, right? There are apps, new apps that are coming up, which are mobile, because almost everybody has a cell phone right now, right? So there are apps out there that actually help them manage there's a company called, I think it's HealthAware. I mean, I can't think of the name right now, but they have a app that is prescribed by the physician for type 2 diabetes, right? And they provide the app. So they actually got FDA clearance just recently, saying that this is a prescription that they actually give, and that actually helps them manage their insulin and everything else, right? To manage their whole the treatment regimen, for example, right? And if they actually have lower sugar, say, you know what, you should probably go take go get some juice to drink or something like that. So it's a very, very interactive app that actually helps the patient to try and manage their disease, right? But those kind of apps are something that's going to come up more and more. And I'll talk a little bit about how the regulatory aspect of this is changing as well, because now it's become more everywhere, right? I mean, it's become that anybody and everybody can do this. How do you try and manage the regulatory aspects as well, right? And then employees are providing health programs as well. GE has a Health Ahead program that is extremely popular. It's been around for 5 years now, where we actually provide guidance to people about how to live healthy, how to become healthy, how to quit smoking, and everything else as well. So that's become quite popular. With all of these, it's moving more towards a patient-centric healthcare and trying to make sure that the patient actually has control of what they have to do and how they have to do it. Right? I don't know how I'm doing my time. And then there are three other aspects too, as far as how we're moving towards patient-centric healthcare, right? Wearables. I know many of you are in the electronics fields. Sensors are all over the place, right? I mean, in the seminar in May here, we saw that there are about 85 companies that have wearables out there, right? What do, right? They provide us. Now what we have is we have sensors for real-time measurements of all the physiological signals. What do you do with that, right? And then miniaturization of these sensors have actually made some of these possible. Wireless technology has made this possible as well, so that people are not necessarily sort of walking around with cables hanging out all the time, like the Halter devices and so on. And then the analytics, right? The problem is we have all these sensors out there. They provide a bunch of data. What do I do with the data? Right? I have no idea what I'm going to do with the data. Just telling me that, oh, your heart rate is this, or you're probably having a heart attack, whatever it might be. So we've got to try and figure out how to convert that data to information, and not just stop at information, but also try and move it into some decision making, right? So that is what's happening. And I think the next piece is the digital health. Digital health has been, I think, a little overused right now. Everybody's using digital health. people like companies like Google and Apple and Amazon, who are not necessarily healthcare device companies, are getting into this field because they have the consumer market, Samsung as well, right? They have the consumer market already tapped in, and if they can actually help with trying to provide the healthcare solutions on top of it, they're going to become winners. So, and the other perfect example is recently, I don't know if you saw, but Philips actually combined their healthcare business with their consumer business, right? They combined that into one group. Maybe this is what they had in mind. I don't know. I don't know what Philips had in mind, but it makes a lot of sense that making healthcare more consumer focused, patient-centric focused is sort of what the whole direction is as well. So again, the digital health is, what we can do is with the wearables that you have, you can collect continuous patient data, right? Right now, if somebody had some event and they went to the doctor, right? The nurse collects all the information, the physiological information for that specific time and event, and then they provide some guidance based on just that one snapshot, right? And then they go back again, they take some medication, they go back again 6 months later, and then they check the physiological measurements for that instance and then say, okay, here, I'm changing your medication, right? Doesn't even make any sense, right? This whole continuous data, who knows what changed, in the middle, what was going up and down. Maybe it was the time of day that they went that it was actually the measurements were a specific a number or whatever it is, right? Maybe it is just what they ate in the morning. So there's absolutely no logical sense, if you think about it, to try and take a snapshot of data and provide medication changes and things like that. So digital health means, if we can use the wearables to provide data, continuous data of the patient throughout the whole 6 months, right, before they go back into the patient, and the doctor has enough information and intelligent information, be it using AI, analytics, whatever it might be, that they can actually make a decision or change the decision that they're going to make. That is sort of where we're trying to, the whole thing is changing as well, right? And training and education is another piece as well. One of the things, trying to make it easy to use for patients, for consumers. Before the talk, I was talking to some folks here, right, talking about how do we try and get acceptance, right? When you have a new technology, when you have something new, how do we try and make sure that people actually accept it? Right now, the instruments or the devices that we actually make are so difficult to use that there's a huge resistance by the physician to say, you know what, I'm not going to change. I'm happy with what I have right now. I'm able to provide good, reasonable or good guidance to my patients. I'm not going to change. Just leave me alone, because what you're going to give me is going to be a lot more difficult for me to learn, and I'm not really going to try and make my technologists learn this as well, right? And then fail-safe designs, I'll talk a little bit more about that. That is a very, very key factor that I don't think anybody's looking at right now. Go ahead.
Are you going to mention EHRs and the whole electronic health records and how the doctors are trying to comply to that meaningful use aspect of ACA? Because I think they're trying to deal with that obstacle right now, and that's why they might be resistant to the other means.
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg, right? Because I think the regulatory, I'll talk a little bit about the regulatory aspects later on as well. But to answer your question, the regulations, again, similar to the doctors, right? The regulatory agencies are comfortable with what they have today because they have gone through it. It's a well-established process. And now it's sort of the whole, when you're flipping around completely, they don't know how to react. So they're just trying to withhold what they know is working well. So what we have to do as device companies, as hospital systems, as educational institutions, try and help the FDA, try to help the government agencies understand what they have to change and try and understand the risk profile and show them that, here is the risk profile that's going to change from here to here. This is where we're moving. How do we try and get there? So that the whole regulatory process is sort of tied into it as well. And it's an evolving process, right? Just like the whole healthcare ecosystem is changing, the hospitals are trying to change, and the whole regulatory agencies have to change as well. But they don't necessarily want to get in trouble because they made a very aggressive change. All right. Oops, sorry. And again, technology has been great. Don't get me wrong. Especially in healthcare, it has been just absolutely wonderful. However, it's sort of, okay, sort of what I have, right, is, the high field MRI you can see structures that you've never ever seen before. You can actually see the cortex, the neocortex, and everything else. Multi-slice CT, ultra-fast CT, new drugs. I'm not going to read everything, but it's been excellent. But if you look at it, everything in the healthcare field, it's increased cost, it's increased complexity, it's increased the healthcare spend, and there's an overabundance of technology that we don't know what to do. I mean, how many of you have actually used every single feature in your smartphone? I don't think so, right? We don't really use all the features. So the point is, as healthcare device companies, as healthcare manufacturers, we tend to try and make the best resolution, the best system, the best possible knobs and things that you can have for people to move around, but they probably use maybe 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 things of the features, right? So how do we try and understand what the customer actually needs or what the end consumer actually needs? I mean, to give an example, it's not really a healthcare example, but like our appliances teams, right? They had looked at the microwave and said, okay, how many of the buttons somebody actually uses? You go and do an observational research and said, just 3, right? Start, stop, and time, right? Why do I need all the other 20 other buttons that are there, right? So those are the things that, and the point is that if you go and ask a person saying, do you want all of these buttons in the microwave? They're going to say yes, right? So same thing with the doctor. If you go and ask them, what do you want in a CT? They're going to say, I need 64-slice CT or 128-slice CT. But they don't know any better. And again, I was talking to Charlie earlier on. How do you try and understand what is the problem that you're trying to address, right? And sometimes the end customer does not know because they don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know that a technology or a solution that we have can actually solve the problem that they have today, right? So that's very, very critical, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. And then again, the last piece is the tech envy and obsolescence, right? I mean, everybody, how many of you actually went and got an iPhone 6? Is there a need to get an iPhone 6? I don't think so. iPhone 5 is fine. But it's just the tech envy and everything else, right? That, I have to have the latest technology on me. So before that, any questions so far before I go into sort of, where we as technologists or engineers and scientists can actually help with this whole changing ecosystem? Go ahead.
Is it working? Okay, so you mentioned that hospitals make around 3% profit, but the way I'm seeing that healthcare is going to be in the future, it seems that hospitals will not have, I think the profit will further go down depending on you get a certain amount of money and then you have to just decide what tests need to be done. So will this trend discourage hospitals, and what do you think should be the way to resolve that?
Yeah. So good question. I didn't mention it, but what's happening right now is hospitals are getting consolidated, right? Hospitals are all getting consolidated from being multiple hospitals into big one because they cannot be profitable. You're absolutely right. They may be at a 3% profitability right now and they're going down, but if they keep going down, they cannot survive. So either they close or they consolidate or try and change the way they do things. So they have to become more efficient. They group up with more people to try and become more profitable or something. So that's a huge problem. And that is a problem that all the hospital systems are facing today.
Just a quick question. When somebody like GE, it's very sophisticated, Fortune, whatever, 100, does their strategic planning in this area, do they look at 2 really big outliers but reasonable probability, such as whether it's Ebola or whatever, a major epidemic, and number 2, whether or not there will be a dollars for deaf type of euthanasia movement, because many people really just don't want to live, they're kept alive, and most of this money is spent in their last few weeks to months. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering if you at GE would consider such radical possibilities.
So how we are a profit company, okay, for-profit company. So when we look at, what are the areas that we want to try and address, right? What are the, I'll talk about the last piece later, okay, as far as would we actually do something dramatic like, trying to come up with euthanasia type things or not. But if you look at how do we actually pick what technology to work on, what disease to focus on, or what area to focus on, we typically tend to look at the bigger ecosystem, trying to understand where can GE as a company, working with other partners, provide the best solution that's going to make money, right? So we're not there to try and provide a solution that's not going to make money for us, because then it just doesn't make sense for us. So we are not a non-profit company, right? But what we do is that if we do find that there's an area that needs help, and it has to be at a very low cost, we try to provide the solution as just a good enough product that will help that specific, if it's for a system in Africa or India or Indonesia where they cannot afford much money, we'll try and come up with a solution that's just catered to them, right? Rather than trying to put all the bells and whistles that you would do in Europe and Asia. So how we pick, and again, everybody has different ideas, right? I mean, there's just so many different ideas out there, and if you try to go and fund all of them, we're going to get bankrupt, right? So how we try to do is try to pick which are the areas that we think strategically would actually help a big problem, and also make sure that we are actually profitable as well, because at the end of the day, if we're not profitable, it doesn't make any sense for us to invest money. As far as would we actually go into areas where, dramatic, like what you said with euthanasia or anything, I mean, again, we are a big conservative company, okay? I don't know if we would do that. There are certain things that we have looked at as far as helping the elderly live their life in a much more peaceful way, in the sense that trying to provide technologies to help them just live better, right? Live a much more peaceful life, so.
Okay, we'll just take one more, and then we'll get back to you.
So maybe you're going to discuss this. The legal system. I think one of the things missing in your slides as yet, maybe you will be talking about it. How does that influence the technology? I mean, we know about the legal system, the tort system, across with that. And how does it influence the development of your technologies? So
it's again back to let me make sure I understood your question, right? You're talking about the litigation in the US that if I have a device and it said I got a heart attack and my doctor didn't do anything about it, am I going to be penalized or not? And I think that's where we have to work with the regulatory agencies and try and make sure that they understand what the indications for use is, right? And this is where I was saying it has to be a very tight partnership with the government and the hospitals and so on. The apps that are coming out there right now, right? I mean, there are certain first movers that have set examples, working with the FDA, trying to make sure that the legal aspect of it is actually addressed as well in what they say the indications for use is. So I'm not saying it's a bigger problem in the U.S. than the rest of the world. The rest of the world, it's a different, it's not the same as it is in the U.S. from the legal standpoint. But I think it's our responsibility to work closely with the regulatory agencies and make sure that whatever we provide as the indications for use is what it is. So it's not a simple problem, and hence it's not a simple solution, but it's going to be something that evolves over time. All right? So again, what I think one of the things that we have to think about, right, as we're looking at new technologies is to try and make sure that we are solving real-world problems. Okay, and that's where I think, we tend to do technology because it's cool. It's cool, and it's providing the best resolution, it's providing the best image quality or whatever it might be, and that's not going to work anymore, right? It's worked until now, but it's not going to work anymore. So we really have to turn around and understand, make sure we provide cost-effective solutions, right? The cost of equipment, the cost of development, the complexity has to be low. We have to make sure that the healthcare costs are low as well. So when we provide a solution, we have to look at the whole ecosystem and say, okay, if I provide this to the hospital, am I going to increase your profitability or not? That's what the hospital is looking for us. At least with GE, they always say, wait a minute, you're telling me you have this, but how is it actually going to improve my profitability? If it's not going to improve my profitability, I'm not going to invest money in it, right? So we got to, anytime you think about new technology and new solutions, you got to think about the bigger picture, the real world problems that are out there. And it has to be manufacturable, right? And Charlie and I were talking earlier, the good or bad, healthcare industry is not a very large volume like mobile phones, right? Like cellular phones. Typically the number of instruments that we sell is probably 100,000, maybe hundreds or thousands, not more than that. It's not in the 10,000s or the millions that the phones actually sell, right? So how do we try and make sure that it's manufacturable and cost effective in a much, much smaller scale, right? How do we, when we try to come up with the technology, we have to think about all of these different aspects and design it such that you can actually do it, right? And again, one of the things I talked about earlier was, I know it's not written down here, but how do you try and understand what is the problem out there, right? When you go and ask a doctor, when you go and ask a physician or radiologist saying, hey, what do you need? I mean, you have this MR, do you need a 7T MRI to see the brain better? If you ask them that question, they're going to say yes, right? But how do you try and make sure that you understand their true problem rather than, because they don't know what they don't know, right? They may not even accept your technology because it's something completely different than what they have. So how do you try and convince them? How do you try and make sure that I mean, one of the things that I tell, I mean, as Charlie was saying, I was in Beijing for 3 years where I actually was there to grow a team there, right? And one of the first things I did is have every engineer in my team go and visit a hospital and watch an MRI, a hospital do an MRI for a whole day. Just observational research, right? And it was unbelievable. And they had to come back and report back to me, right, saying, what did they learn, right? It's amazing. Many of the mechanical engineers came back and said, wow, I'm spending so much time and money on this, but they never even use my feature, right? I said, that's a perfect opportunity for you to take the cost out, right? But the point is that you have to be there to try and observe and understand because you have a point of view, they're using it a certain way. Are they not using it because they don't know or they don't need it, right? How do you try and understand all of that? So observational research is also something that's critical for us to understand what exactly the customer needs are as well, right? And again, it has to be ubiquitous, it has to be everywhere, it has to be easy to use. The number of people who are a lot more experienced, and again, this comes back to the acceptance, right? The physicians are going to, if it's complicated and it's not easy to use, the technologists are not going to accept it. The physicians are not going to accept it. The radiologists are not going to accept your technology. So how do you try and make it so that it's everywhere? And then data, right? With the whole big data movement that's happening, there's just tons of data. And there's devices as well, wearables. There's just so many devices out there, just spewing data and data after data, right? What do you do with the data? Because it's just too much to handle. It's just too complicated. How do you try and convert that into useful information? And how do you convert that into something that provides a decision, right? And this is where, coming back to the FDA, right? Typically companies don't want to make decisions because then they're afraid they may be liable, right? How do you try and work with the regulatory agencies to make sure that that decision making is not necessarily going to add risk to your enterprise, right? And the last piece I wanted to touch on a little bit. This is something that I don't think anybody has actually done, right? And this is something that I have thought about. I call it self-aware solutions, okay? And what this is that as you're getting more and more devices to the home, because that's where most of the devices are going to be used, because we're going to try and keep the patients out of the home so that they can actually live a better life and reduce the overall healthcare cost. How do we know that the device is actually dying, right? How do we know that the device is actually malfunctioning, right? So somehow we have to put all the smarts into the device so that it can self-diagnose and say, you know what, I don't think I'm working well, or somehow provide that information back. And that is something that I don't think people are thinking about as much as I think it should, right? The wearables and everything else. So the reliability has to be to a completely different degree, right? And always when you try and increase the reliability, it increases the cost as well because you're trying to add redundancy and everything else. But how do you try and manage this dichotomy of trying to make it much more reliable but at a much, much lower cost as well, right? And then the diagnostics is what I'm saying. Somehow it has to be able to do a self-diagnostics to say that, oh, I don't think I'm working well today, so I do something about it, or somehow alert somebody about it, or so on. So that's something that is very, very important for this whole healthcare moving from the hospital to the home, right? It just becomes a lot more critical. So when we think about technologies, when we think about devices, when we think about new things, right? How do we try and put all of these pieces in there? And once you have all of these pieces in there, those are the ones that are going to flourish before than others that actually have better resolution and better technology out there. And then just to close, you got to understand the bigger picture. As I said, right? You have to know what is the problem you're trying to solve. I say this to my team all the time. You cannot do technology for technology's sake, right? You cannot. It has to be relevant. And it has to be relevant to the current environment, right? The environment is just changing dramatically. You've got to be in touch with the changing environment to make sure that you're actually developing a solution that's relevant today, right? And again, it's about patient care, quality of life, and healthcare costs, which I talked about throughout the whole talk. Think about what is it that we're trying to solve and address it in a cost-effective way and addressing the exact problems. The problem is global, okay? Every country has the same problem in healthcare. However, the solutions have to be local, right? The solutions absolutely have to be local. I mean, this is something I was telling, I think, Charlie earlier on. You know, I lived in India, right? I grew up in India, and I moved to the US for college. But I thought I knew what emerging markets or emerging countries' healthcare systems were, right? I mean, I've been there, I know, right? So when I moved to China, the first week I went to a hospital, and I realized I was absolutely clueless. I mean, I lived in the US for 15 years, and I had no idea what the emerging market healthcare systems needs are, right? So the solutions that you have for India and China or Indonesia or any other emerging countries is going to be completely different than the solutions that you may provide for the US or for Europe. Again, it'll probably, things that are working in the emerging countries at the lower cost will probably translate very well to the developed countries as well, because if it provides all the necessary data that they need, that I know we talked about reverse innovation, right? That is something that you can innovate upwards rather than trying to go from the top down. For the last 20 years or so, most of the companies have started at the top, provide the best possible technology and try and take down features and bring the cost down. That's not going to work anymore. You got to go from the bottom up. Find the best solution with the good enough solution, and then try and build it up. All right. And again, the regulatory environment is tightening. The FDA and the CFDA, everybody's trying to understand how do I, with this whole proliferation of moving towards the patient, what do I do? What do I regulate? What do I not regulate? How do I try and manage this so that it's safe? Because at the end of the day, their goal is to make sure that people are safe, right? It's safe for the people and so on. It's continuously evolving, tightening. So the medical device manufacturers are getting much more regulated, right? But we also have to try and come up with new innovation, try to come up with new things as well. You had a question?
Yes, I have a question. Do you see this whole movement getting more local? Do you foresee this movement getting completely local in terms of local communities starting to take care of their own healthcare, in the sense that almost taking out the insurance industries completely out of business? Do you see this as a possibility at some point, that local hospitals typically start offering healthcare options to the people around them, and this becomes a very local effort?
I haven't heard, I mean, there's only one instance I've heard of that where, so it's possible, right? Because what we're trying to do is trying to find a solution to solve this problem that's competing pulling in different ways. So whoever comes up with the best solution that's going to address all of these different problems is the one that's going to win. So, I mean, that may be where it ends up. So I don't know. And I think to end it, right, I think the challenging problems need smarter solutions, but we need to make sure that the solutions address the actual customer need in a relevant environment, right? And constantly keeping a touch on it so that when things are changing, you're not working on something 2 years and then find out that, oops, what I started working on when it was relevant is not relevant anymore. So how do you try and make sure that you constantly keep in touch with the changing environment so that you can change as you go along? And again, MedRC is a perfect example, tighter partnerships with academia, industry, providers, and government as well. I missed out government there. So the tighter partnership with all of these different agencies is absolutely critical in order for us to address the changing healthcare system.
Thank you, Sudha. Otherwise, we won't even get to give her a round of applause before we douse her with questions. Here we go.
So I'm not talking about the US when I ask this question, but there are certain societies who don't care about healthcare unless they actually are growing old and falling sick. What would be your suggestion to make them aware of keeping track of their health, even though they are healthy, but just monitoring their basic health? What would be your suggestion?
So there are several campaigns that are going around. And I mean, India is a perfect example, right? I mean, you don't go to a dentist unless you have tooth pain. You don't go to the doctor unless you fall sick. China is similar. If you go to the rural parts of China, it's very similar. Indonesia is similar. So there are quite a lot of countries, especially the emerging countries, who have that problem, right? So what we are trying to do, and I think companies, nonprofit organizations like the Gates Foundation, like the Susan Love Foundation for breast cancer, they're trying to come up with these educational programs that they actually go out and try and do a campaigning of different sorts, right? So in Africa, the Gates Foundation is actually going out and making sure that people understand that they have to go take care of their health, for cardiovascular disease and so on. So it's happening throughout the whole world through these nonprofit organizations, and many companies like GE and Philips and Siemens partner with these nonprofit organizations to try and expand the reach. So it is a problem. I would say we've just sort of scratched the surface of it. There's just a huge problem there as well. And that adds on to the chronic disease piece, right, that I talked about, right? Because people are getting sicker later and hence the cost of medical care is actually high as well.
Sudha, I have a question it's a little more on the business side, I think. So GE is I would characterize it as a B2B business. You sell to hospitals and larger medical organizations, and with your flipping around, it basically has to be changed to a B2C business. Yeah. And two drastic things happen: the technologies and the things that you make, and second, who you sell to. If I go back to computers, it wasn't that easy for the digital equipments and the Honeywells to survive. So what is GE doing? Everybody knows it's coming. You certainly have forecasted. What are some of the things you do inside to start to make those changes?
So absolutely agree. I mean, we got to move from a B2B to a B2C company. Otherwise, we're going to be irrelevant, right? I mean, we don't want to be irrelevant. We want to try and be relevant and be profitable. So, I mean, I'll just give you one example. In our whole breast cancer, if you look at the tomosynthesis system, right? I don't know if many of you have seen the campaigns out there, but we're moving more away from, trying to just sell it to the hospital to sell it to the customer, to sell the capability and the advantages to the consumer. Similarly, working with foundations out there with Susan Love and other things, trying to make sure that we are reaching out to the end patient, right? We're not there yet, we're moving the needle, but that's sort of what we're looking at, and we totally understand that just continuing to be a B2B, you're going to become irrelevant.
Other questions? Anyone else? Yeah, back there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You said something very interesting that I hadn't thought about, talking about profitability for the hospitals. I think about profitability for the device manufacturer, and I just imagine that they would sell it to the hospital and the hospital would give this fee to the patient. But I guess it's more complicated than that. Insurance companies have to cover this new service or this new test or this new equipment. So how does that work? What are the dynamics there? If you come out with a new technology, what makes insurance companies cover it, and what are some of that types of?
Okay. So it's a whole complicated process, right? As I've said, and sort of repeating that again. But typically when we come up with a new device or a new indication for use or a new drug, right, we have to convince the CMS, sorry, thank you, the CMS to say that they would actually reimburse for Medicare and Medicaid for that specific device and that specific indication for use. That typically takes a very, very long time, because what they're looking for is they're looking for clinical trials, clinical studies to show the efficacy of the new technology, the new drug, the new treatment, whatever it might be, right? So it doesn't matter, just creating the technology alone gets us nowhere, right? Working with the most successful product, if you would, is when we're actually working closely with CMS, working closely with the clinical sites, and providing clinical evidence for a specific disease or specific treatment or whatever it might be. So trying to get that whole ecosystem together, moving forward together, that's when the hospital will actually get reimbursement from the Medicare, Medicaid, and the insurance companies in order for that specific procedure or test or whatever it might be. So that's a huge timeline, right? Trying to get the CMS on board. So typically when we know that we have a completely new technology, something coming out, we try to engage some of these agencies sooner than later. Right? And it's not an easy process. I'm not saying that it's, I might have made it sound like it's as simple, but it's not. You're right. So it's a big circle that, in order for the hospitals to actually start getting money paid by the insurance agencies, that's what has to happen. Otherwise, the patient has to pay out of pocket. Right?
We can take one more question. Yeah.
Hi. So in the pyramid that you described, it seems to me that the role of technology is to eliminate the doctor. It's like we don't really need the doctor anymore because we will have apps that will tell us what's wrong with us.
Yeah.
Is that so?
I don't think so, because I think again, maybe 30 years from now, you'll have like the Star Trek type doctor, somebody come and tell you what's wrong with you, but there's just, we don't have, I talked about there's just so much data, right? I don't think we actually understand the information or the decision making that actually comes out of the data very well. It's just such a the human body is such a complicated system that it's not that straightforward, right? So if you look at a cancer type, right, it's not all the same. There's the same cancer can have like multiple different types of cancer type, and the treatment for each one of them may be completely different, right? And the problem is that the treatment for one cancer type of the same cancer can actually make it worse for the patient than better as well. So there's just a lot of complicated and analytics that goes in the human body that we don't know that right now. But maybe in 100 years, it'll probably be that way. But
replacing the doctor, I think, is going to be very evident. I was just at the big conference at Beth Israel on surgery, and I was able to get a video on how of really good surgery and really bad surgery for the same surgery. Mm-hmm. And if this could start to go viral, mm-hmm. people would start to realize that 70% of the surgeons are really hacks. Yeah. They can't sew, they can't cut, they do damage to internally, and the top 10-20% are hard to find. Yeah. And so it's a very graphic thing to see good versus bad. So if I was GE, that's a major area that I would try to take over.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that's sort of what needs to happen, but it's going to take a long time is all I'm saying. There's just a lot of, from the regulatory side, from the physician side, there's just a lot of roadblocks that we have to cross to try and get there. I agree.
Well, thank you again, Sudha, for a topic that's relevant to all of us now and in the future.
Thank you.